Hey, welcome back. We are still talking about Kindred by Octavia Butler. We have lots to say about this book. And today we're going to talk about this idea of relative morality. So in the last couple of videos, I've mentioned how there is a big gap between our present understanding of what is right and wrong and our past understanding of what is right and wrong. And not so much about what is right and wrong. Like I said, we in the 21st century can look at American chattel slavery and say, without much fear of reprisal, unless you live in the South, that it was wrong. It was bad. It should not have happened, but it did. And we feel fairly safe to make that claim here in the 21st century because we're never going back there. That's not going to happen. So we're fairly comfortable to say that. However, we don't know what it was like to live back in those times, in the 1700s and 1800s, when slavery was an institution. It wasn't a great institution. There were, to say the least, there were people at the time who were trying to dissolve that institution, and at the same time, you had people who were insistent that, okay, maybe it's not great, but we need it. It's very important that we harvest our crops and things along those lines. So there are people living in those times are living in a different context, and we kind of have to appreciate that. You know, this doesn't really absolve them of doing what they did. It doesn't forgive them from being slaveholders, but I think it is useful to examine sort of what their state of mind might be. And I think that's one of the things that Butler may have been trying to do, is try to say, how does somebody see themselves as a good person while still owning human beings as property? How do you resolve those two things in your head? And I think that may have been one of the things she was trying to explore with Rufus and Tom Whalen, the son and the father. We start off, of course, Rufus is a boy. And one of the things Dana tries to do, once she realizes what's going on, that she is being drawn back in time to save her ancestor, is she does try to kind of educate him and try to give him a moral education to maybe start thinking that slavery is wrong, that he should not be a slave owner. She tries doing that. But she has definitely an uphill road to trudge on that one. Rufus and his father are keeping slaves because that's what you do. In pre-Civil War era, you have crops to take in, you have a farm to run. Then having an enslaved workforce is cost effective, and that's how you compete. And even when Tom at first and later Rufus have to resort to punishment, to beatings, to selling off slaves and splitting up families, the impression that you get while you're reading is that they feel bad about having done it, in a sense. It is kind of like a look what you made me do sort of thing, right? Where from their point of view, they're like, hey, we told you what the rules are. We set these things up for you. We gave you a home and a place to live. You insist on trying to run away or trying to defy us. So look what you made us do. Oh, we tied you to a tree and beat you with a whip. So yeah, there are a lot of examples of that in the book. For example, when Dana tries to run away and she's caught, even though she's not actually one of the Whalen slaves, she gets beaten, as an example to the others. There's one point in the novel where at a certain point, as Rufus gets older, he does sort of start to fall in love with Dana, in a sense. And there's a point where one of the guys on the plantation, this big handsome man named Sam, starts to take a liking to Dana, and like that, he is sold off because he was getting too close to her, and he was making Rufus jealous. And that was something that Rufus felt he could do. There were a lot of instances of that, of people being punished, but when you ask the slave owners, they're not mustache twirling villains. They're not sitting on buckets of money going, ha ha, I own human beings and aren't I evil? No, from their point of view, it's like, this is how you run the place and this is how you treat these people. And I got to do what I got to do. And if it means that Rufus, in his sense, is going to exert his power because he is jealous, because he's afraid, because he's insecure, well, that's what he's going to do, because that's what people did. And I think a lot of these characters, there's not a whole lot of white characters in the novel, but I think a lot of these sort of slaveholding characters are doing things because this is the way that things are done. And they genuinely don't understand why people would wouldn't just fall in line, why people wouldn't just do what they're supposed to do. There's various points in the story where, at one point I think Dana brings back a history book with her, and young Rufus is looking through it, and he's looking at sort of the advancement of civil rights, and he calls it abolitionist trash, where for him it's just a matter of settled record that black people should be enslaved. So is Butler playing the sort of, that was the nature of the times card in this story? I don't think that she is. I really don't think she is. I think she's certainly trying to explore, again, what does it take to break out of this? Why do people kind of go along with whatever the context or the culture wants them to do? But she, for one thing, when violence is perpetrated against people in this novel, she makes it bad. She makes it hard to read. She makes it very, very real and graphic and painful. So she's not trying to sanitize the experience of being an enslaved person. When Kevin, Dana's husband, gets drawn back with her, one of the first things he does when they get separated is he joins an abolitionist movement, right? So this idea that, yeah, there were people who were trying to end slavery in the 1800s, and Kevin, as a man of the 20th century, as soon as he can, he joins those movements. He actually does what we all like to believe that he would do. He joins them, he gets injured helping people, he puts his life at risk to help people become free. So I think Butler is not trying to create an imagined past, in a sense. She is maybe trying to look at the various forces at play on people who are at the time, who are living in the time, I should say. And the thing with Dana, and to some extent Kevin as well, is that they know that they are not there permanently. They know that at a certain point, Dana especially, she knows that she's going home eventually. She's not stuck there the way these people are. So yeah, I don't know. It is complicated. And I think Butler definitely is not trying to sort of shrug it off as, well, people in that time didn't know any better. People knew better. People definitely knew better. And I think she was trying to explore what that means and what people knew versus what they thought they knew. One of the things she's kind of doing, in a sense, is addressing the idea of, like I think I mentioned earlier, the good slave owner. There are people today in the 21st century who are still arguing that some slave owners were good because they only beat their slaves a little bit and because they gave them decent food and housing. And I think Butler may have been trying to examine that by making the Whalens more human, right? They could be kind. They could joke. In the book, they joke with some of their slaves. They hang out with them. They talk to them like people and give them a little bit of liberty here and there to do what they want. But the instant you step beyond those boundaries, you get punished. So there is comfort and there is ease, but there are limits. And unfortunately, beyond those limits is living a full and free life. If you want to live a full and free life, that's not going to happen. And it's never going to happen. And what that really means is that enslaving a person, owning a person, is violence in and of itself. It doesn't matter how well you treat them. It doesn't matter if you give them a nice place to live or enough food. You own a person, and you shouldn't. There's a character who named Sarah, whose children are all sold off except for one, and she feels like that's the way it just has to be. She feels like, she can't control that. She's lost most of her kids, and she just has to learn to live with the situation that she's in. There is another character, Alice, who is ultimately Dana's great something grandmother, because she feels like she has to go to Rufus, because if Rufus wants her, and if he doesn't get her, he's going to punish her and everyone she loves. So yeah, no matter how cheerful or jovial the relationship is, there's always a threat hanging over the enslaved person, and that in itself is violent. The father, Tom Whalen, he is not a kind man. He is actually quite sharp and very smart, and goes for the whip real quick. But he's fair, right? When he says he's going to do something, he does it, and he even if he's talking to a black person, he'll still do what he promised to do. So again, he's not a monster. When Rufus gets older, he starts to soften up on slaves being able to read. He promises to free his children, but he's still a slave owner. But yeah, no matter how good a slave owner was, they're still owning human beings, and that in itself is violent and bad. And I think, yeah, Butler kind of wanted to explore that. Like, how good could a good slave owner be within the boundaries of the violence of slavery? And she wanted us, maybe as modern readers, to kind of explore that as well, and to dispel that myth that, yeah, okay, there were people who could be kind to the people they owned, but the act of ownership itself was a form of violence that, if they're participating in it, then they've pretty much already lost any moral ground that they would have had. I read an interview with Butler where she said that she actually toned down a lot of the experiences that she had read about in her research, in that she didn't want to really, I think she didn't want to turn people off too bad. So a lot of what we read, which is, again, violent and really terrible, is not nearly as bad as it actually was. So she said she kind of toned down from what she'd found. She was worried no one would want to read it. And ultimately, I think what she was doing is looking at the relationship between the morality of the past and the morality of the present, and how our present morality derives from the past and our reactions to the past. And that there is a chain, if you will, of moral reaction that goes from slavery is unfortunate but necessary to slavery is always bad and always will be. And I think she did kind of want to look at that as well, and how the morality of the Waylands, her sort of stand-in for slave owners of the time, the morality of the Waylands is no longer dominant in the United States. You cannot reasonably justify owning a human being in the modern US. But it echoes. There are still aspects of it that still permeate, where when you get into topics of systemic racism, when you start looking at the way that Black families have been trying over the years to build wealth and build status, and for centuries have been sort of cut off at every pass, and are only fairly recently being allowed the ability to sort of pass on money or property or whatever to their children. That all of this stuff has echoed to the present, and the reason why we are the way we are today is because of the way things were. And Butler said about this is that she was ashamed of her mother, in a sense. Her mother was a domestic worker, and her mother would go to houses to work, and she'd always go around the back entrance. She was very deferential. She was very sort of, trying to make herself invisible in a lot of ways to the white people she worked for. And Butler said when she was young, she was angry about that. She didn't understand. Mom, why do you do this? What's wrong with you? We're not slaves. Come on. And part of this book is exploring that. And she said in this interview, Kindred was a kind of reaction to some of the things going on in the 60s, when people were feeling ashamed of, or more strongly, angry with their parents for not having improved things faster. And I wanted to take a person from today and send that person back to slavery. And I think I can see the argument that she's making. And I think we can all look back at our ancestors and say, why didn't you do something different? Why didn't you act sooner? And I think we're still going to do it. When 100 years from now, if we're still writing books, there's going to be an author who sends their character back to the times of before climate change became huge. We're always going to ask our ancestors, why didn't you do the right thing earlier, sooner, harder? And I think Butler's saying, that's easy to say from where we are. That's an easy question to ask from where we are right now. It's much harder in the actual context of things that were going on. And it's harder to see why they didn't behave the way we wanted them to behave back in those days. That's one of the things I enjoyed about the book, is it's offering up big moral questions. It is not necessarily answering all of them. And it is asking us, the reader, to engage with the material and engage with the topics in a very personal way. Now, what I also find interesting is, again, as I alluded to, I have freedom in time travel. I could go back to the early 1800s and I could, walk around fairly unmolested. I would not have that same liberty if I were a Black man. That doesn't exist. And so I would really be interested in seeing how a Black reader, especially a reader who has ancestors who were enslaved, would react to this book, because I think it's going to be different. I think there's going to be a different reaction that I cannot have, and I'm fascinated to hear about that. So if that's you, and if you would like to, tell me what your thoughts were as well, please feel free to do so. But until then, thank you very much. See you next time.